The house was small but cozy, tucked away on a quiet suburban street. To anyone passing by, the family seemed perfect. Michael, a tall man with intense brown eyes and a commanding presence, was the quintessential devoted husband. Sarah, with her always neatly styled blonde hair and a smile that could light up any room, appeared to be the perfect complement to Michael's figure. At the center of it all was Sarah's sister, Emily, a vibrant young woman whose green eyes carried a mix of mystery and audacity. But as the saying goes, not everything that glitters is gold, and within that house, there were cracks that only deepened over time. Emily had moved in with her sister and brother-in-law after losing her job. The decision, which seemed like an altruistic gesture from Sarah, soon began to create tension. The once harmonious atmosphere was now marked by long silences and glances loaded with hidden meanings. Michael, always helpful, constantly offered assistance to Emily, but Sarah couldn't help noticing how his attention seemed to cross the boundaries of mere kindness. Meanwhile, Emily, with her provocative demeanor, seemed to enjoy testing limits, making the home's atmosphere increasingly heavy. The worst part was that even as suspicions grew, Sarah tried to ignore the signs. After all, no one wants to believe that betrayal could happen within their own home. But the whispered conversations between Michael and Emily, the muffled laughter when Sarah wasn't around, and the furtive glances were like small sparks on the verge of igniting everything. No matter how much Sarah tried to avoid it, the feeling that something was about to explode became almost impossible to ignore. Something bigger seemed to be looming, as if fate was preparing to deliver an inevitable blow. It was a sweltering summer afternoon, and the sun shone intensely outside, but inside Sarah, something felt dark. She had left work early, something she rarely did, with the plan to surprise Michael with a special dinner. Little did she know that the surprise would be of a different kind. As she entered the house, the silence felt strange, almost deafening, interrupted only by muffled laughter coming from upstairs. With her heart racing, Sarah climbed the stairs slowly, trying to shake off the growing sense that something was wrong. When she pushed open the bedroom door, the sight hit her like a heavy blow. Michael and Emily were together in a scene that left no room for doubt about what was happening. For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed. It was as if the world around her had stopped. The look of panic in Michael's eyes, Emily's almost defiant expression, and the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears created a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. The betrayal laid bare so crudely tore something inside her. Michael stammered out empty excuses in an attempt to justify himself, while Emily remained silent, her provocative gaze speaking louder than any words. The pain and humiliation were unbearable, but Sarah gathered the strength to leave the room, leaving them both behind. As she descended the stairs, the tears began to fall, hot and uncontrollable. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, and each step was a monumental effort. Sarah didn't know what was worse: being betrayed by the man who had vowed to love her, or by the sister she had always protected. Feelings of anger, disgust, and disbelief swirled into an internal storm. She collapsed onto the couch, trying to process the scene she had just witnessed, but everything felt unreal, like part of a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. However, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. Something deeper and even more devastating was about to unfold. The morning after the discovery, Sarah felt the need to regain control of her life. Even though her heart was shattered, she decided to confront Michael with the only solution that seemed reasonable: divorce. With a trembling yet firm voice, she declared that there was no way to continue. Michael, pale and anxious, begged for a second chance, promising that everything had been a mistake. Emily, on the other hand, remained silent, her gaze carrying a mix of regret and disdain. Sarah stood her ground. For her, any chance of rebuilding had been crushed the moment trust was betrayed. "I'll move on with or without you," she said before walking out of the house. Hours later, something unexpected happened. Sarah received a call from the police, informing her that Michael and Emily hadn't shown up for work. Their cars were found parked in different locations, but there was no sign of where they could be. At first, Sarah thought they might have gone off together, trying to escape the chaos they had created. But as the hours dragged on, fear began to creep in. That same night, the police contacted her again, reporting that both of their belongings had been found in an isolated area, suggesting a possible robbery followed by abduction. Sarah's heart froze. As hurt as she was, the thought of something terrible happening to them was unbearable. Days passed and the investigation brought no good news. Authorities announced that the chances of finding Michael and Emily alive were slim. A charred body found in an abandoned vehicle heightened suspicions of a robbery turned homicide. Although the confirmation was still inconclusive, the police decided to close the case, declaring them dead. Sarah, engulfed in a mix of guilt, relief, and grief, found herself in an emotional whirlwind. Even though she had decided to separate, she had never imagined that fate would take such a cruel and definitive turn. The void left behind was unbearable, but there was also something she couldn't ignore: the nagging feeling that the pieces of this story didn't quite fit together. After Michael and Emily's disappearance, Sarah found herself in a desperate situation. Michael had been the primary provider for the household, and without him the bills began piling up rapidly. The rent was overdue, daily expenses seemed to multiply, and the balance in her bank account dwindled by the day. Sarah, who had left her job to focus on her home and marriage, now faced the daunting challenge of finding new employment in a competitive market. Each day was a battle against anxiety and fear of what the future might hold. Yet, amid the chaos, an unexpected piece of news brought a glimmer of hope. During a conversation with the lawyer handling Emily's estate, Sarah learned that her sister had a significant life insurance policy. At first she couldn't believe it. Emily had never mentioned anything about it, but the documentation was there, clear and undeniable. Since Sarah was Emily's only living relative, the lawyer explained that she would be the beneficiary of the payout, provided there were no disputes. The news felt like a momentary relief, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt she could breathe a little easier, believing that the money might help her rebuild her life. However, as days passed, an inexplicable discomfort began to grow within Sarah. While the life insurance money seemed like a solution to her financial troubles, the thought of receiving money tied to her sister's death left a bitter taste. She tried to justify it to herself as a practical consequence of a tragedy, but something felt off, as if the relief came with a shadow she couldn't yet fully understand. There were details about Emily and Michael's disappearance that remained unresolved, and Sarah began to wonder whether the money was truly the answer or the beginning of something far more unsettling. Determined to get her life back on track, Sarah went to the bank to initiate the process of withdrawing Emily's life insurance payout. As she waited in line, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Finally, something seemed to be going right amidst the chaos. When she was called up, she handed over the necessary documents and explained her situation. But instead of the expected result, the bank teller's expression changed. He glanced at the monitor, typed a few more details, and with a serious tone, informed her that the entire insurance amount had already been transferred to a digital account under her name. Sarah was stunned. She had made no such transfer. Confused, she asked for more information. The teller explained that the digital account was linked to her phone number and that the transactions had been made just a few days ago. Immediately, Sarah reached for her phone to investigate, but something strange happened. The screen kept freezing and apps were closing on their own. The more she tried to access the information, the more her device seemed to spiral out of control. Panic began to set in. None of it made sense. Sarah hadn't authorized any transactions, nor had she ever created a digital account tied to the insurance payout. Who could be behind this? As she struggled to regain control of her phone, an unsettling thought crossed her mind. Could someone be using her identity? Images of Michael and Emily flashed through her head. Despite everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. Was this a coincidence or part of a more elaborate scheme? Sarah knew she needed to act quickly. Without the money, she was vulnerable, but the gnawing question was even more unsettling. Who had taken control of her financial life, and more importantly, why? With no other options, Sarah decided to take her phone to a repair shop, hoping to solve the issue. The shop was modest, but the technician, an experienced man with small glasses and a meticulous demeanor, examined the device carefully. Shortly after, he returned with a concerned expression. "Your phone has been cloned," he stated seriously. Sarah felt the ground fall out from under her. He explained that someone had gained remote access to her device, monitoring her activities and, worse, using her banking apps. She was stunned. The thought of someone manipulating her financial life and stealing her identity felt like a nightmare. Without wasting time, Sarah rushed to the nearest police station. The sense of urgency was almost unbearable. The $1 million payout, her lifeline, was at risk. At the station, she explained the situation with a trembling voice, struggling to stay composed. The officer who attended to her, a man with a stern face and attentive eyes, asked detailed questions and filed an official report. He explained that phone cloning cases were common, but the amount of money involved made this crime especially severe. "This money can be recovered, but we need to act fast," the officer said as he requested Sarah to provide all the information she had. Despite taking the right steps, Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling of helplessness. Who could have done this? And why did it feel so orchestrated? The thought that Michael and Emily's disappearance might be connected to what was happening wouldn't leave her mind. Even with the police involved, fear and suspicion grew within her. And as she awaited further instructions, Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that the mystery surrounding her was far from over. After all, something much larger than she had imagined was unfolding, and the answers lay somewhere between the shadows of her past and the present. The days that followed were a mix of tension and anticipation. Sarah received news that the police had managed to trace the origin of the fraudulent accesses. The location was an isolated house in an affluent neighborhood, far from the profile of a typical cybercrime perpetrator. Anxious for answers, Sarah waited as the authorities planned an operation to raid the address. What they might find there could be the key to solving the mystery that had tormented her since Michael and Emily's disappearance. When the police finally entered the residence, what they found was baffling. The house was a display of opulence. Luxurious furniture, half-empty bottles of expensive champagne, designer clothes scattered across the rooms, and accessories that oozed wealth. However, the couple who clearly lived there had vanished, leaving behind a trail of extravagance and puzzling clues. On a table there were forged documents, including identities corresponding to the names of Sarah, Michael, and Emily. The discovery left the officers intrigued, but for Sarah, the sight of those papers was like a punch to the stomach. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Despite the apparent abandonment, the scene suggested that the couple had left in a hurry, possibly tipped off about the police's arrival. Sarah was devastated to learn that the perpetrators had escaped, but the question that haunted her was, who were these people? And how did they connect to Michael and Emily's betrayal and disappearance? The answer seemed close yet still out of reach. For Sarah, the mystery only deepened her sense that fate was playing a cruel game, one where she still didn't know all the rules. The investigation seemed to be heading in an unexpected direction when Sarah received the call that would change everything. The officer in charge of the alleged homicide case, a woman with a stern demeanor and a direct manner of speaking, revealed that a firearm had been found near the charred body attributed to Michael. The discovery was disturbing in itself, but what came next left Sarah breathless. An intact fingerprint had been identified on the weapon, and the police needed her fingerprints to proceed with the analysis. The feeling of being trapped in an endless nightmare consumed her. On the scheduled day, Sarah arrived at the police station, her hands trembling and her heart racing. As the officer collected her fingerprints, she couldn't shake the gnawing doubt. Why did they need her prints? It made no sense. Sarah knew she hadn't touched any weapon, let alone committed a crime. But at the same time, the fear that something was being manipulated to incriminate her was undeniable. The officer, though professional, maintained an analytical gaze that made Sarah feel as though she were already on trial. In the days that followed, Sarah's anxiety reached a new peak. Every call from the police station sent a jolt of adrenaline through her, and every minute of waiting was pure torture. The discovery of the fingerprint only seemed to further complicate the puzzle of betrayal, death, and mystery. And deep down, one question haunted her. What else was hidden in this story? No matter how hard she tried to stay calm, Sarah knew that the worst might still be ahead. After all, every revelation seemed to pull a thread that unraveled even darker secrets. When Sarah received a call from the police station requesting her urgent presence, an overwhelming sense of unease gripped her. Upon arrival, she was led to a small room where the officer in charge of the case awaited her with a grave expression. "The fingerprints found on the weapon match yours, Sarah," the officer declared as an almost tangible tension filled the air. Sarah felt her world collapse. She stammered in shock, trying to explain that it was impossible. "I've never touched a weapon," she insisted, but her protest seemed futile in the face of the evidence. Before she could fully process the accusation, Sarah was handcuffed, her rights read to her in a detached tone as the officer informed her she was being arrested on suspicion of involvement in the homicide. The humiliation of being led away like that was unbearable. As she walked down the station's corridor, the cold stares of the officers felt like knives piercing her dignity. Sarah knew she had to fight for her innocence, but the situation seemed like a maze with no way out. The idea that something larger and more sinister was orchestrating this began to solidify in her mind. In the cold, cramped cell, Sarah tried to gather her thoughts. Who could be manipulating the circumstances to incriminate her? And why? As much as she searched for answers, all she found were questions and a growing sense that she was being used as a pawn in a cruel game. With every passing hour, the despair deepened, but there was one thing Sarah couldn't ignore. She knew she was innocent, and that certainty would be her strength to face whatever lay ahead. Sitting in the corner of the cell, Sarah struggled to organize her thoughts while the weight of the accusations and her imprisonment threatened to crush her. Her mind was in constant turmoil when a guard appeared, announcing a visitor. She was surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone. In the visiting room, a tall man with a piercing gaze and a menacing posture awaited her. He was dressed impeccably, but his cold smile sent an immediate chill down her spine. As she sat across from him, he wasted no time. "My name is Brian. I was Emily's boyfriend. We have unfinished business to discuss." Sarah was stunned, trying to process what the man meant. Brian leaned forward, his intensity making her heart race. In a calm yet threatening tone, he explained that he was behind the phone cloning and the transfer of the insurance money. "But now we have a problem," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "With the phone disabled, I can't access the account. I need you to give me the passwords again. And before you think about refusing me, Emily is alive and I have her." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The mention of her sister, whom she believed to be dead, hit her like a blow. Maintaining his menacing tone, Brian showed her a photo of Emily tied to a chair, her face marked by terror. "If you don't cooperate, she dies. It's that simple," he said, tossing a phone onto the table between them. Sarah, overwhelmed with panic, knew she was cornered. If she gave in, she would fuel Brian's dark scheme. If she resisted, she would risk her sister's life. With tear-filled eyes and a trembling voice, she tried to buy time, searching for a way to escape the web of terror closing in around her. Every second was a battle between fear and desperation, and Sarah knew that any wrong move could be fatal. Sarah had no choice. Pressured by the threat to Emily's life, she gave Brian the passwords, feeling utterly defeated. He left the room with a victorious smile, leaving Sarah in a state of complete helplessness. In the days that followed, she desperately sought news of her sister, but no concrete information emerged. Brian seemed to have vanished, taking the money and possibly Emily with him. Months passed, leaving Sarah with an even deeper void. No money, no answers, and an accusation still hanging over her. Yet fate, as cruel as it seemed, had one more twist in store. On a gray morning, Sarah was summoned by the officer in charge of her case. The serious and mysterious tone hinted that something significant had occurred. "We found Brian," the officer said, placing a photo on the table. The man who had manipulated and terrorized Sarah was dead. His body had been discovered in an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of the city, showing signs of a struggle but with no clear clues as to who might have been responsible. Most intriguingly, the money was gone. None of Brian's known bank accounts showed any activity, and the substantial sum had vanished without a trace. Despite the surprise, Sarah couldn't feel relief. If Brian was dead and the money gone, what had happened to Emily? The investigation took an even more confusing turn, leaving questions unanswered. Who had killed Brian? Was it retaliation from someone he had deceived? Or was something even darker at play? As the police worked to piece together the puzzle, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. The shadows of the past continued to surround her, promising even more unsettling revelations to come. Months after Brian's death, a new piece of evidence emerged, completely shifting the direction of the investigation. A witness claimed to have seen a woman resembling Emily at a small hotel in another city just days before Brian's body was discovered. The description was precise: piercing green eyes, brown hair, and a wrist tattoo identical to Emily's. The police, intrigued, began considering the possibility that Emily was alive and perhaps more deeply involved in the events than previously imagined. For Sarah, the revelation was a mix of relief and terror. If Emily was alive, why hadn't she come forward? And more importantly, what was her role in all of this? The new line of investigation uncovered inconsistencies in the narrative presented thus far. Emily and Michael's disappearance, the alleged robbery, and even Brian's death began to appear as parts of a meticulously crafted plan. The police re-examined the life insurance records and financial transactions, uncovering patterns suggesting that Emily might have been the true mastermind behind the fraud. Sarah, who had already faced so many twists and turns, was now forced to grapple with the possibility that her own sister had been manipulating her from the very beginning. Love and anger intertwined as she tried to comprehend how someone so close could be capable of such betrayal. Meanwhile, the police intensified their search, but Emily seemed to have vanished completely. No clear leads on her whereabouts surfaced, and every breakthrough led to more questions than answers. Still imprisoned, Sarah felt like a pawn in a game far beyond her understanding. If Emily was alive, Sarah needed to know the truth, not just to clear her name but to confront the shadows that had destroyed her life. The investigation was far from over, and it felt as though the conclusion to this story would be even darker and more unpredictable than anything that had come before. As the investigation unfolded, the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. The police confirmed Emily's involvement in the scheme that led to Michael's death and the disappearance of the insurance money. The evidence was irrefutable: manipulated bank records, witness statements, and even traces Emily had left during her escape. Justice was served and Sarah was released after months of anguish. Though scarred by everything she had endured, she walked out of prison with her head held high and a renewed sense of determination. As compensation for the judicial errors and the damages caused, Sarah received a generous settlement, enough to rebuild her life. With the money, Sarah decided to completely change her surroundings. She purchased a home in a peaceful town, far from the painful memories that haunted her. Gradually, she rebuilt her life, investing in her own projects and learning to trust again. It was during this new chapter that she met David, a kind and genuine man who brought light and stability to her world. He was everything Michael had never been: attentive, honest, and committed. Over time, love blossomed, and Sarah, who once believed she could never love again, found in David the partner she had always longed for. Life seemed to have finally turned a corner. Sarah and David married in a simple yet deeply meaningful ceremony. It wasn't long before they had 2 children who brought even more joy to their home. The laughter of the children filled the house with life, and as Sarah looked at them, she realized that all the suffering had led to something greater: a chance to discover her strength and her ability to start anew. There were still scars, but now they were part of a story of resilience. Each day, Sarah reaffirmed her decision to leave the past behind, living fully in the present with her new family. It was a quiet morning like so many others in Sarah's new life. The sound of children playing in the yard and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the house with serenity. But everything changed with the unexpected sound of the doorbell. Sarah opened the door and froze. Standing there was Emily, the sister she thought she would never see again, with disheveled hair, a face marked by exhaustion and a desperate look in her eyes. "Sarah, please let me in. I have nowhere else to go," Emily pleaded, tears streaming down her face. The shock was so overwhelming that for a moment, Sarah couldn't respond. With a mix of anger and disbelief, Sarah shut the door without saying a word, trying to control the storm of emotions flooding her. David, who was in the living room, noticed her distress and asked what had happened. When she told him that Emily was outside, he was surprised, but unlike Sarah, he didn't react with anger. "She's your sister. No matter what she's done, maybe she's here because she really needs help," he said in his calm, rational tone. Still shaken, Sarah retorted, "David, you don't understand. He destroyed my life. I can't just pretend that nothing happened." David, however, didn't back down. "We all make mistakes, Sarah. I'm not saying you have to forgive her, but maybe helping her is what she needs to finally face what she's done." Sarah looked at him, struggling against the swirl of emotions. She knew David always tried to see the best in people, but for her this was a wound that hadn't yet healed. On the other side of the door, Emily continued to wait, her presence a living reminder of everything Sarah had fought to leave behind. The dilemma was clear: let her in or close that door for good. And the choice once again felt heavier than she could bear. Sarah stood frozen at the door for a few seconds, Emily's pleas echoing in her mind. David's compassionate gaze, filled with quiet insistence, eventually tipped the scales. Reluctantly, she opened the door. "Come in," she said curtly, avoiding direct eye contact with her sister. Emily hesitated as she stepped inside, her eyes brimming with tears and her posture defeated. "Thank you, Sarah. I just need a safe place," Emily began, but Sarah raised her hand, cutting her off. "You have 5 minutes to explain what's going on." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Emily started talking, but her words were vague and disjointed. She claimed she was on the run, that people were after her, but she avoided going into specifics. Something about her story didn't add up. As David listened silently, visibly concerned, Sarah began to feel that this was yet another of Emily's manipulations. She excused herself and stepped out of the room, leaving David trying to calm her. In the hallway, Sarah had an idea. She returned to the room, her tone suddenly feigning understanding. "All right, Emily. I'll help you. Why don't you go to the bathroom, wash your face, and try to collect yourself?" Surprised, Emily agreed. As soon as Emily stepped into the bathroom, Sarah locked the door from the outside. The sound of the lock clicking startled Emily, who began pounding on the door and shouting, "Sarah, what are you doing? Let me out." But Sarah didn't listen. She grabbed her phone and called the police, explaining the situation. As she waited, David tried to intervene. "Sarah, don't you think this is a bit extreme? What if she's telling the truth?" Sarah, however, was resolute. "You don't understand, David. She's always had a way out. This time she's going to face the consequences." The tension mounted with every passing minute, Emily's shouts growing louder behind the locked door, while the sound of approaching police sirens echoed in the distance. The sharp crack of splintering wood echoed through the house, followed by the crash of the door falling open. Emily, her eyes wild and her breath ragged, had managed to break out of the bathroom. As Sarah rushed to the front door to meet the arriving police, David, who had been trying to stay calm throughout, approached Emily, concerned. "Emily, what are you doing?" "We just want to help," he said, extending his hands in a gesture of peace. But Emily, consumed by desperation, pulled a knife she had hidden at her waist. Before David could react, she lunged, driving the blade deep into his neck. Time seemed to freeze. David collapsed to the floor, clutching his neck in a futile attempt to stop the blood gushing from the wound. His eyes met Emily's for a fleeting moment, filled with disbelief and pain, before they closed forever. Sarah, hearing the sound of David's body hitting the floor, turned to the scene and was overcome by an indescribable terror. There stood Emily, the bloody knife in her hand, her expression cold and unrecognizable, a stark contrast to the desperate woman who had begged for help just moments earlier. Horror and anguish consumed Sarah as she screamed at the top of her lungs, "No! What have you done?" The police burst into the house at that very moment, drawn by Sarah's screams. Emily tried to run but was quickly subdued and handcuffed. The scene before them was grotesque. David lay lifeless on the floor and Sarah, kneeling beside him, was sobbing uncontrollably. Emily, even in handcuffs, maintained a defiant stare as though she felt no remorse. Sarah, through her tears, kept whispering over and over, "Why, Emily? Why did you do this?" But Emily remained silent as the officers led her away. At that moment, Sarah realized that the nightmare she thought she had overcome had reached a new and horrifying depth, and that her life would never be the same again. As the officers escorted Emily out of the house, the unexpected happened. In a swift and desperate move, she broke free from one of the officers, shoving him against a wall. Before the others could react, Emily grabbed Sarah, pressing a knife against her neck. "Nobody moves or she dies," she screamed, her voice filled with hatred and desperation. The air grew heavy, the sound of children playing in the yard abruptly stopped, and everyone froze, fearing what might come next. Sarah, trembling with fear, felt the cold blade against her skin. "Emily, please, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice weak and tears welling in her eyes. But Emily seemed unfazed. "You ruined everything, Sarah. I didn't come back to hurt you, but you left me no choice," she said, tightening her grip around her sister. The officers, striving to maintain calm, began negotiating. "Emily, let your sister go. There's no need to make things worse. We can resolve this peacefully," one of them said, his tone firm yet measured. Emily, however, appeared increasingly unstable. "You think I'm going back to that cell? You think I'm going to let everything I planned end like this? Never," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. Sarah, despite her terror, searched desperately for a way to escape. She thought of David, her children, and everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. She knew she had to survive, not just for herself but for them. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as everyone held their breath, the tension mounting like a bomb about to detonate, while Emily's next move loomed ominously over them all. The silence in the house was oppressive, broken only by the sound of everyone's rapid breathing. Sarah, her heart pounding and the cold blade of Emily's knife pressing against her neck, knew she had to act. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable, but she remembered the knife she had tucked into her waistband earlier when the police had detained Emily. Staring straight ahead, Sarah feigned resignation, letting her hands slowly fall to her sides, her fingers brushing the hilt of the hidden blade. Emily, consumed by her rage and paranoia, didn't notice the subtle movement. "I'm not going back to prison, Sarah. I'd rather die first," Emily whispered in a menacing tone. It was in that moment, while all eyes were locked on the escalating tension, that Sarah summoned every ounce of courage she had. With a swift and unexpected motion, she partially twisted her body and drove the knife into Emily's abdomen. The shock on her sister's face was immediate, her wide eyes meeting Sarah's with a mix of pain and disbelief. Emily collapsed to the ground, dropping the knife she had been holding. Blood quickly pooled across the floor and within seconds she lay motionless. Sarah, trembling and gasping for air, sank to her knees, overwhelmed by a torrent of emotions: relief, guilt, sorrow, and exhaustion. The police quickly surrounded her, ensuring she was safe. One officer knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now. It's over," he said, his voice calm and steady. But for Sarah, that end felt like the beginning of yet another chapter in her life, one where she would have to find the strength to move forward, not only from the loss of David but also from the devastating reality of having ended her own sister's life. Time passed, But the scars left by the traumatic events in Sarah's life never completely faded. In her new home, she focused all her energy on her children, creating a household filled with love and security. Every laugh from the kids was a reminder that, despite everything, she had reasons to keep going. Slowly, Sarah managed to establish a routine, resuming her personal projects and rebuilding a life that, while peaceful, bore the shadow of all she had lost. At night, when silence enveloped the house, Sarah often found herself gazing at the wedding ring she kept in a small box. It was a keepsake of David, the man who had shown her the true meaning of love and loyalty. Despite everything that had happened, Sarah knew she would never be able to love anyone the same way. David had been her safe harbor, her anchor during the storm. Even in his absence, he remained present in her memories, in every choice she made, and in the care she poured into raising the children they had dreamed of having together. Though life moved on, her love for David was eternal. He wasn't just a part of Sarah's past but also a guiding force in her present. Every day was a new beginning but also a tribute to the man who had been her great and faithful partner. Sarah knew that as her children grew, she would continue to share stories about the father they had, ensuring that David's memory would never be forgotten. After all, he wasn't just a painful reminder, he was proof that even in the most challenging circumstances, true love could transform lives. Sarah's life had been a roller coaster of emotions. Love, betrayal, loss, and redemption. Sitting on the porch of her home, watching her children play in the distance, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on everything she had been through. Life isn't always fair, she thought, but it's in adversity that we discover who we truly are. For Sarah, love had shown different faces. The warm embrace of a loyal partner, the sting of betrayal by those who should have stood by her, and ultimately the unconditional love she felt for her children, the driving force that kept her going. Trust was another lesson learned the hard way. Trusting others wasn't always safe, but learning to trust herself had been life's greatest gift. She realized that even in moments when everything seemed lost, there was a quiet strength within her, waiting to surface. It was this strength that kept her standing when it seemed impossible, that made her fight for truth and justice. Trust in the world may waver, she thought, but trust in myself, that no one can take away. Finally, Sarah reflected on resilience and the power of inner strength. Life had tested her limits, taken away what she loved most, but it had also transformed her into someone stronger, more aware of her worth. Strength isn't about never falling but always finding a reason to rise, she told herself. She understood that her pain had not been in vain. It had shaped the woman she had become. A devoted mother, an unwavering fighter, and above all, someone who refused to be defined by her past but by the choices she made every day. In that moment, Sarah smiled, her heart full of gratitude. As difficult as her journey had been, she knew that every step had led her to this point, where she could finally feel at peace. True love, trust in herself, and the strength to begin again were the greatest lessons life had given her, and she would carry them with her forever. Welcome to Spooky Stories, the channel where thrilling and mysterious tales come to life. Here you'll hear stories based on real events with names and details changed to protect identities and, of course, to avoid any legal issues. So, get ready to dive into intriguing cases full of twists and turns that will keep you hooked until the very end. If you enjoy chilling and surprising stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. And don't forget to leave a like. It helps us bring even more amazing tales to you. At the end of this video, we've got a suggestion for another thrilling case waiting just for you. Stick around and uncover the secrets behind these dark stories with us.